好，各位同事，我哋咧就夠鐘夠人啦。
It's the appointed time, my colleagues, and we have a quorum. I call to order the panel on housing. This is still the new year, so I hope you all are happy, that you all have a happy new year. First of all, the first item of our agenda is confirmation of minutes. Please refer to paper number bracket 1400/18 to 19. It was given to members on the 31st of December. So far, we have not received any proposals for amendments. I ask members to confirm the minutes. Minutes confirmed. Item 2, information papers issued since the last meeting. The Secretariat has issued a number of papers that are set out in the agenda. For items under discussion in the next meeting, please refer to paper number CB bracket 1388/18 to 90 bracket 02. That is the list of follow-up actions. That is bracket 01 and the list of outstanding items for discussion. The next meeting will cover 2 items. First is measures to facilitate the mobility needs of elderly residents by the Hong Kong Housing Authority, and the second one is the progress of the total maintenance scheme of the Hong Kong Housing Authority. The next meeting will take place at 4:30, which is the Tuesday on the 12th of February. Any questions from members? If not, that will be confirmed. Next is a matter of concern to members is the Long-Term Housing Strategy Annual Progress Report 2018. I ask members to press the request to speak button if you want to speak. I welcome representatives of the administration to join us. You'll find information paper and background information. The numbers of the papers are also set out in the agenda, and these papers have already been given to members. We have with us Secretary for Transport and Housing, Mr. Frank Chan, Permanent Secretary for Transport and Housing, Mr. Stanley Ying, Deputy Secretary for Transport and Housing, Ms. Esther Leung, Assistant Director, Strategic Planning, Housing Department, Ms. Sandra Lam, Deputy Secretary for Development Planning and Lands 1, Doris Ho, and Assistant Director of Planning Special Duties, Mr. So Chun Kwok. Please be seated. I'll first ask the administration to take us through the paper. Depending on the speaking time the number of members who wish to speak, I will set a time limit. First of all, I'll ask the Secretary, Mr. Frank Chan, to take us through the paper. Thank you, Chairman. At the end of last month, the government has announced the annual progress report of last year, that is 2018, on long-term housing strategy. I'll go over the salient points and respond to certain points raised. We have principles of supply-led and flexible strategy adopted by the LTHS. We have put the 10-year housing target forward by 1 year so that we can plan early and to meet long-term housing demand. According to the latest projection, the next 10-year projection period, that is 2019 to 20 to 2028-29, total housing supply target is 450,000 units. Compared to the 460,000 target, there is a reduction of 10,000. The main reason of the reduction is that the net increase in number of households has dropped by about 12,000 households. On the 1st of September 2017, in the projection we have published, you will find relevant figures. It says, according to the report, that the rate of increase of number of households in the coming 30 years will continue, but the rate will be reduced. You may refer to the annual report for details. Based on the total housing supply target of 450,000, we have adjusted the public-private split in the coming 10 years to 70-30. That is, for public housing, there will be a supply of 315,000. Private housing, there will be a supply of 135,000 units. If all land are used, we reckon that we'll be able to construct about 280,000 units, which is a shortfall from the supply target of 315,000. There are views saying that we have deliberately reduced the supply target by 10,000 because we could not catch up. And there are also views saying that there may be increase in supply in the future. However, there is a widening gap between the shortfall of actual production and the target. As a result, the target becomes meaningless. I would like to say that we have, in accordance of the framework of the LTHS, taking into account objective data, work out the long-term supply and demand. When we set our targets, we have always been transparent by releasing information of supply and demand. We have disseminated clear information. In order to meet the latest target, we have to overcome difficulties. We have to work together to increase land supply so that in the coming 10 years and beyond, there will be increase in housing supply. In order to meet the long-term housing supply target, in the past few years, the administration has been adopting multi-pronged approaches to increase the supply of public housing. For the production of public housing of 248,000, it is an actual increase of by about 10,000 compared to the figure of 237,000 for 2018-19. The HS and the HA, starting from 2018-19, will churn out 100,800 units. There are views saying that, if there is a reduction from 180,000 units to 135 units in the private sector, it will further fuel the exuberant market. I'd like to say that the total number of demand has shown a reduction of 10,000. Well, there may be a reduction of 45,000 units. However, when it comes to public housing, there will be an increase of 35,000. As a result, we see that there is a reduction in demand. The reduction in private housing will be absorbed by the public sector, especially subsidized sales flat. On top of that, we have seen changes in the external environment, changes in interest rate, changes in supply and demand. So it is difficult for us to predict the future trend of property prices. We'll continue to adopt a multi-pronged approach to try to achieve an equilibrium. We'll closely monitor the trend in the property market as well as external environment. In our annual exercise, we'll take into account the economic situation at that time before we adjust the ratio of public and private housing. We do need to increase housing land. We will try our best to identify land. On the 29th of June last year, the government has decided to reallocate 9 sites at Kai Tak and Anderson Road Quarry for public housing. We reckon we will be able to provide 10,600 public housing units. This will help narrow public housing shortage in later years. We will consider reallocating more private land for public housing. In order to make better use of government land on Island North as well as Kowloon Peninsula, we will increase the development density by 20% by allowing a relaxation of plot ratio by 20 plot ratio. There will be a maximum increase of about 30%. However, it doesn't mean that there will be an across-the-board increase. Relevant government departments will take into account the impact and feasibility of change in the plot ratio before making a decision.
The task force for land supply submitted a report to the administration on the strategy as well as the priorities of options. The task force points out that there is an urgency for the land supply solution. It also pointed out that the increase in land supply is far higher than the 1,200 hectares as delineated by the administration. We need to have a multiple-pronged approach to increase to a large extent the land supply. In such a way, we have the determination to address this long-standing issue. We will take into serious consideration the options presented by the task force. This will need to have interdepartmental consultations in the identification of land. In the LTHS, we will also facilitate short-term community initiative to increase transitional housing to relieve the people that are in difficult situation. There's a task force on transitional housing under the Transport and Housing Bureau in order to provide coordinated support for community initiatives, and we will facilitate their efforts. The task force are now facilitating over 10 projects. For instance, the community housing movement, in particular, the Nam Chau Street housing scheme, supported by the Hong Kong Community Care Fund. We would welcome your views on this report. We have 14 members ready to speak. You will have 4 minutes for question and answers. So we have Mr. Kwok Ka-kee, Mr. Lau Kok Fen, Mrs. Alice Mack, Leung Chi Chang, Wu Chi Wai, Andrew Wan, Chung Chung Tai, Gary Fan, Vincent Chen, Fernando Chen, and Chen Hoi-yan. I also welcome members who are upstairs to come down and speak. Well, you are really presenting your New Year greetings year by year, but going downhill all the time. This LTH strategy presented over and over again can only make us sadder and sadder. We have 116,000 IHH living in STU, deplorable living situations. You said that you would increase by 10,000 units. However, these are changes all the time. Well, 70% of public housing, but it would increase GSH. That means to say that they have to fork out to buy. We were thinking that 70-30 split would be providing more PRH, but that is not the case. You have a great debate on land supply for over a year. There are 6,000 hectares, brownfield sites, village housing, as well as public recreational sites. So after a year and a half, this only aims to have this Lantau tomorrow vision. So we are talking about 10 or 20 years, and you even dare to present it as a solution to our our housing problem. This there are 166,600 IHH households. They are paying rents higher than the central. So when can they have the PRH? You say that there are about 237,000 needs in units, and you are now playing a game of controlling private market supply. This is something that we all understood. However, if this is to continue, we have no hope whatsoever. Well, the young people have no hope, and the people are emigrating. Why is it so? That is because of the policies. For instance, for the housing, it is a basic need. Mr. Frank Chen, you should apologize, bowing to all the public present here. When can these 110,000 households will be able to have PRH? So we are saying that you have to wait 7 years. Secretary, long-term housing supply in shortage is not something that you can solve overnight, and the administration is going all out to solve this shortage in housing supply. We are identifying sites that could be made available, and it is obvious that no short-term solution is available. That is why we have established this task force. I'd like to ask, when will the 116,000 households have PRH? We have some short-term facilities. The plot ratio will be increased by 10%, and the spade-ready sites will also be made ready for, as well as reallocation of sites. Well, you have not answered this specific question of when the 110,000 households can enjoy public rental housing. Mr. Lau Kwok Fen, this is longer, and the AWT is getting longer and longer. Well, you have a 70-30 split for public and private housing. Well, you have to have a bigger pie. If you don't have a bigger pie, even if you adjust the split, ultimately you won't have a great increase in the supply for public housing. You are only playing lip service, because the gap is getting greater and greater. In 2017, there's a shortage of 40,000. For 2018, there's a shortage of 60,000, even with the adjustment of the split. So what are the ways that you can adopt to increase the pie or increase the basic land supply? In paragraph 15, it is said here that private housing, you are reducing. There's a reduction of why is it that you have 45,000 decrease in the reduction of private housing? There is a discrepancy of 30,000 between that and the public housing shortage. Now, if you are adjusting the split by, you have made the adjustment of the split, and yet for both private and public housing, there is a reduction. We are revising the split from 60-40 to 70-30. For the public housing, there is adjustment between the PRH and the HOS. For the total amount of public housing is 280,000. However, for the 2019 to 2030 is 315,000. So if we have this PRH and the SSF, you can see that there are 200,000 increasing to 220,000 for public housing. As for the SSF, it will be increased from 80,000 to 95,000. So there is an increase of nearly 30,000, which means that we are not only PRH, we also increase not only PRH, but also we have taken into account SSF. So the total public housing is on the increase. How can you bridge the gap and enlarge the basic figure? Even if you revise the split, there is a 60,000 gap still existing. If you look at the material provided, we can see in the recent past, in paragraph 9, it is said here that the administration has reallocated 20 sites to convert it to public housing usage, increasing it by 27,000 units. So this we will reallocate spade-ready private sites, converting them to public sites. Mrs. Alice Mack. Well, for the PRH problem, the waiting list problem, it is a lack of land supply. That is why we are advocating use of brownfield sites, reclamation, as well as resuming the Fenlang golf course. Well, the golf course, there's a rumor that a golf course will be resumed as a park, but not for public housing. So I'd like to ask the determination of the administration in this respect. Well, we have a starter home scheme. Well, we can see that it is from private sites. Well, for the URA, you need to use the URA sites. Some URA sites are suitable for PRH. The third question is, in the next few years, there are few land that we can identify for PRH. So are you going to have rent control? And can you assure that there are enough renting units from the private houses? Well, for the apart from the facilitator role of the administration for transitional housing, are you going to step in as well? So there are three questions. As for the Land Supply Task Force, we are studying seriously the report as well as the options proposed. And when we have made a decision, we would make known. Of course, there will be response for the Lantau tomorrow view as well as for the Fenland Golf Course. Well, the URA, we respect their decision. For the plot resumed, they will consider building first-time homeowners. Now, the chief executive has indicated that there would be earmarked 70% for new developed areas. As for the subsidies for rent and the rent control, we have said many times that from our studies, we have already indicated that rent control and rent subsidies in a situation where the land supply is not increased will only lead to the rent rise.
And it may make home seekers, it may make it more difficult for those who would like to find a home. And in relation to transitional housing, the task force on transitional housing has done a lot of work. They have talked to a lot of NGOs. This is not just about modifying industrial housing. And we have made some suggestions as a result. Mr. Leung Chi-chung. Housing is the most important area of the work of the government. There has been some changes in the policy. We are caught between the devil and the deep blue sea. You have adjusted the public-private split to 70-30. We wonder whether there will be a repeat of what happened in Tin Shui Wai. That is, a majority of housing is public, causing an imbalance. Now that they have adjusted the split to 70 public, 30 private, but you have not specified how much of that will be public housing, rental housing, and GSH, and how many will be SSF. You have not explained to us why you find it acceptable to change the split from 60-40 to 70-30. Those who are waiting for PRH have been waiting for a very long time. I do understand, but you do need to give us a clear explanation. I think the biggest problem we encounter now is are those faced by those living in public housing, PRH units. They started off as a nuclear family. Now that the children have grown up and the children may get married. As a result, they have become overcrowded households. And if their children move away, these households may become well-off tenants and they will be evicted. If you chase them away, that means you force them to split up the family, and then they will have to queue up again. It looks like you can't resolve the housing problem. You may say that there is a housing shortage, and these are the solutions you have proposed. So what about these underutilized households, well-off tenants? How many units have you recovered every year? Does it help with alleviating the housing shortage? Give me a percentage. Secretary. It is made clear in the LTHS that about 450,000 housing target, the split will be 70-30. That is, 315,000 will be public unit, 135,000 will be private. And there is also a split between PRH and SSF, standing at about 70-30. Our policy when dealing with well-off tenants and underoccupied households is to make sure that the housing resources are properly used. We have been hearing different views, but if a household earns about $28,000 a month, 5 times of that will be $130,000. The asset limit is about 2.8 million. So under the one-track system, these well-off tenants will have to surrender their units for those who are in a greater need. Mr. Wu Chi-wai. Thank you. I noticed it's mentioned in the paper that in order to increase public housing production, plot ratio will be relaxed. However, it hasn't been pointed out in this paper that after the plot ratio has been relaxed, that means there will be a greater need of various facilities and services. Does it mean that there will be adjustments to the supply of these facilities as per the adjustment of the plot ratio relaxation? Can you make sure that community facilities and services will be adequately provided? The same applies to schools and transportation. Or you only focus on increasing land supply without addressing other issues? Is it the case that for non-domestic users there will be similar adjustments to ensure that there will be adequate services and facilities provided as after the plot ratio for domestic use is increased? I'd also like to talk about transitional housing. You're talking about at least 10 years before you can produce these units. Still, having done everything you promised, there is still a shortfall of 60,000 units. In relation to transitional housing, do you have any measures, any strategies to meet a certain percentage points of housing needs? Say, for example, X% of the housing demand will be met by transitional housing. If you don't have any such measures, everyone will have to wait for 10 years and it's too late. For housing projects, there are many instances we see that in the coming 10 years that there is no planned use for certain sites. Say, for example, the Disneyland expansion. We see sites that will be left idle for 10 years. Are you going to use them for transitional housing? Secretary, Mr. Wu asked about adjustment of domestic plot ratio. Well, the answer to that is that we don't just adopt an across-the-board adjustment. Various factors will have to be taken into consideration. When it comes to new sites and existing public housing, we will conduct a review We will take into account supporting facilities, the environment. Even if it is found to be feasible, we will have to get approval by the town planning board. So these issues will be properly addressed. Mr. Wu also mentions about transitional housing. We do understand that adequate land will have to be identified for construction of permanent public and private housing. Transitional housing is only an alleviating measure because it takes time to identify land. We will do our best. As far as possible, we have not set any fixed target. Mr. Andrew WAN. Well, I think people are rather disappointed when they read the annual reports. You're always chasing your target, and I think the administration is just dangling a carrot in front of the public. And these figures are rather dubious. They said that in the coming 10 years there'll be a shortfall of 60,000 units. But if you read between the lines, for public housing of 248,000 units, it is still not certain. You said for the first 5 years there will be 147,200 units. Is it an accurate estimate? The LTHS is more like a castle in the air. They are quite bold to announce a target that they know they can never meet. If they say that for 2027, 28, they can churn out 147,000 units, I would be quite surprised. There are people living in appalling living conditions. Of course, you will have to leave no stone unturned. Finding land to redevelop old PRH estates is one of the ways. It's not a short-term measure, but it has to be a medium to long-term measure. There are public housing estates that have low plot ratio, or are also, for example, Kwai Sing Estate West. Why don't you consider redeveloping these estates? Some members mentioned about golf course. Well, if you read in detail the report, public views are that they would like the entire golf course to be resumed. I would like to ask, what is the stance of the THB? Will they try to fight for more? I hope that the administration will get back into the driving seat. You always emphasize that it will be bottom up when it comes to transitional housing, and you ask NGOs to make proposals. You will only help them to remove barriers, but that is not enough. We'll have the budget soon. Will you set up a fund for transitional housing? You earmark $1 billion for industrial buildings, and they're all just band-aid measures. Why don't you simply set up a proper fund for long-term development of transitional housing? Secretary, just as Mr. WAN said, in the coming 5 years, we see that public housing production will be about 100,800 units. But we are quite optimistic. Say, for that we have conducted a review exercise of a number of sites. Starting from November 2018, we have completed the rezoning of 119 sites. We will be able to churn out about 190,000 units. Well, for the 4 new development areas, they will produce about 210,000 housing units. We are confident that we will be able to produce number of units that meet the target, be them public or private housing. If you refer to the latest projection, residents who are affected by redevelopment, we have already taken into account some of the redevelopment of public housing estates. In relation to transitional housing and the financial resources, Mr. Wan has mentioned about the setting up of a fund when he met with the financial secretary. I'm sure he will take that into account. What about your stance? I am the secretary for transport and housing. If there is any way to increase land housing supply, I will welcome that. Any members who are in the building, if you would like to ask questions, please come to this meeting. Each member will have about 4 minutes. Next member is Dr. Cheng Chung Tai.
Well, in paragraph 10 of the document, so you now have the PRH/GSH, and this is the first time that the PRH is thus revised. So the public should see very clearly that the administration is not really the revision to 70-30 split. The administration is distorting the PRH definition, and this is an impact that we can yet to foresee. And we'd like to ask the administration, if you revise PRH to PRH/GSH, GSH, is it public housing to be sold to the public? So is there a ratio between PRH and GSH? PRH, then it is the provision of public renting housing. So is there a target for the split between PRH and GSH? Well, if you don't have a ratio between PRH and GSH, the 70-30 public-private split is meaningless. So even if the GSH candidates have to fork out money of their own, so you are now distorting the market, because you are not only distorting the public housing, you are distorting also the private housing. So what are the considerations for the PRH GSH? So under what situation would you allocate it for PRH, and under what situation you would allocate GSH? Well, if you are poor, go further out. Well, you could do that. So there is no clear idea of what are the criteria for you to allocate sites for PRH or to GSH. Well, since the PRH and GSH are different in nature, why should you put them all together? Are you saying that the poor cannot have the PRH they need? Well, are you saying that PRH would be turned to GSH? Would that be further down the road? I'd like to have clear explanations from the administration. Thank you. I'd like to state very clearly here. The administration is providing PRH for those that are in need and that cannot afford private rents. And this will not change. So the PRH and GSH, we have said over and over again that we would adjust home ownership or the GSH according to situations and needs. GSH is targeting those who are living in PRH or who have passed the eligibility vetting. So if they have a GSH, they would surrender their PRH. And if they have succeeded in GSH, they would also get off the line for PRH. I would like to know that on what criteria would you base yourself for PRH sites and GSH sites? Are you saying that you have GSH sites in town and PRH and on the periphery? Well, if you are talking about PRH and GSH sites, basically speaking, we have said in LegCo that the SSF and the GSH will be arranged according to the low maintenance costs. So for the PRH, GSH sites, we are not saying that PRH in the center will be turned to GSH schemes. The annual progress report is keeping up the real estate market. It's not for a solution. So very often you have said that there are other factors involved. For instance, the mobilizing mobile population or the students or the non-local buyers. So these are, you even mentioned the investment needs, not including the investment needs of investors. So now you are, other factors, there are 31,000 units. So there are 17.70% is for the demand of non-locals. So you are now changing the split. So the private units will be 135,000. So according to the supply target, 22.4% of private units will be targeted for non-locals or non-investment of locals. So the Mr. Chen, he said that the sale of land will only be 13,800 units. So it's a reduction of 23%. In fact, you are increasing demand and reducing the supply, which means that the land, the real estate will rise. So I'd like to ask, to increase the non-local buyers ratio, you would increase the price of private demand. So why is it that you have such a projection? And I also mentioned to the chief executive that reducing the split, the demand will still be high. Would you adopt the policies of Australia so that you would have a stipulation that non-local buyers have to either live in or lease out the units that they have bought within a certain period of time? First of all, you have to understand that the 10-year LTHS is a projection according to the population, etc., so that we can identify land sites. It is not a matter of land supply. We are revising the split to 70-30 because we know full well that there is a huge demand, and that is why we have increased the supply to 70%. There is no consideration or motive to maintain the real estate price. Well, you may not aim for that, but the result is there. I'd like to clarify and reiterate. The public and private split to 70-30, it is aimed at meeting the needs of locals. Why is it that 5 out of 1 unit will be dedicated to non-locals? Mr. Leung Yu-jung. The Secretary's presentation can be summarized that the administration would identify sites in an all-out effort. Well, the Secretary has been saying that ever since his coming into office, but this cannot solve the problem because the land supply would need a long lead time for site formation, etc. How do we solve the problem of IHH with a very long waiting time for PRH? The Secretary says that we are doing a lot of work. We have a task force for transitional housing helping the community to address the transitional housing needs. I'm really surprised. Well, Mr. Andrew WAN proposed a fund to be established. I'd like to ask, why is it that the administration will not take up the responsibility to provide for transitional housing? Under the colonial administration, they have provided temporary housing, solving the problem of transitional housing. But now you are throwing the ball into the court of the transitional housing to the community services. Now, why is it that you are not using some sites that may be available for transitional housing? The administration has the responsibility to change that. Well, the task force on transitional administration will not solve the transitional housing needs. The housing department is going by building one, demolishing one, and going in turns. So there's not it's not proving to be efficient for the shortening of waiting time. So in the Leung Chun-ying administration, there are 21 estates that have to be redeveloped because they are in dilapidating situation, and if they are redeveloped, the land use will be more optimized. So you are not doing that at all. This is not a good way to solving the long-term needs. Mr. Leung just said that for the housing department or for the transitional housing, I have to be clear. We need to have 315,000 units for public housing. So the housing department is shouldering a very heavy burden. We hope that they can focus on quantity and quantity to build more PRH for the Hong Kong residents. For redevelopment, we have 4 basic principles. First of all, the maintenance of the existing PRH, the costs of maintenance. And we also need to identify sites nearby for redevelopment. However, in this shortage, the redevelopment of estates would only prolong the waiting time for PRH. Even if there is a higher density for PRH, that would come later, much later on. So in the immediate situation, this can be taken into consideration, but we have to meet the 4 basic principles.
There are more than 10 members who are waiting to speak. The scheduled time will end at 4:25, and I still have to deal with 2 motions from members. So I ask members and government officials to try to keep within the 4-minute limit. I also appeal to members who are in this building to come down if they want to ask questions. I'll have to draw a line later. Mr. Vincent Cheng. Thank you. In relation to the annual report of LTHS, well, I'm aware of the shortage even after the change in the public-private split. I do agree that the government will have to use different ways to find more housing land. I wonder if there are any ways for the administration to compress the production time. Upon the invitation of URA, I went for a visit of the prefabricated housing. This has compressed the construction time. So are there any similar ways that can be adopted by the administration, say for example Seoul Estate? We've been waiting for many years and still they haven't finished with the construction. So has construction period been longer or shorter compared to the past? I would like to ask about transitional housing. I know, Secretary, that you attended an event of transitional housing. You said that although there has been a number of criticisms directed at transitional housing, is so far proved to be quite successful. Is there any chance that they'll be incorporated under the LTHS? Will there be a target set? Even without a target, will you set up a fund to support such development instead of relying solely on NGOs? I'll defer to Mr. Ying to answer the second question. Mr. Chang asked about construction time of PRH units. We have been looking at it in the past few years. When we first announced LTHS, similar questions were asked. In December, we came to the panel to explain to members about difficulties we have encountered as well as progress. I'd like to emphasize one thing. If it is spade ready, when everything is ready, then the HA will just take over the site and conduct foundation work. The pace is quite fast. Sometimes when it comes to other sites, it will take a longer time because of rezoning, district consultation. It has taken quite some time. We will continue to look for ways to speed up the construction. What about prefabricated housing? Well, the government has been advocating prefabrication of housing. In the past year, the HA has done some work. They have gone to Singapore. We have also asked consultants from the Hong Kong U to do some studies whether such method of construction can be used by the housing authority. But there is one basic principle. Construction time should not be lengthened and number of units should not be reduced. As soon as we've completed the study in 2019, we will explain to the committee under the HA. In the past 2 decades or so, the HA has been using a prefabrication method. Panels have been fabricated on the mainland for assembly in Hong Kong, and this is an approach that the HA is very familiar with. We are studying to expand the scope of such prefabrication. In Singapore, we learned that they use prefabrication method. They have compressed the construction time from 12 weeks to 9 weeks. For HA, we only use 6 weeks to complete 1 floor. These are technical issues, and the HA will continue to look into them. Dr. Fernando Zhang. Starting from 2015, I find the performance of the LTH as rather disappointing because we have been chasing targets. And it seems that the shortfall has been increasing. What is the purpose of setting the target? Because if you set a target, you will have to try to meet it. But what is going on now is they will conduct an annual exercise and change their plans. It seems that the original purpose has been lost. You may change the split to 70-30, but still you fall short of the target. Between 2015 and 2023, the 8 years, the shortfall stood at 80,000 units. And during that period of time, the split was 50-50, not even 60-40. Now you change it to 70-30. You are still trying to make up the shortfall. Mr. Vincent Chang is very familiar with Tai Hang West. The redevelopment project has been in the pipeline for about 8 or 10 years. That site is spade ready. It's right above an MTR station. Currently, it provides about 6,000 units, and that can be greatly increased after redevelopment. You see that the buildings themselves are rather dilapidated. Redevelopment should have happened 2 years ago. But now you say that you support the application to the town planning board. But we're talking about production of a lot of units in just a few years, and there are many more sites that have been left idle. Why will we have inadequate housing land? The government owns the most housing land, coupled with some major developers. If there is a shortage of housing land, who will benefit most? The government and major developers. You try to control property prices by tightening supply. Members of the public don't even have the means to buy flats. Our youngsters have lost hope because they can't have stable housing. People have lost the hope to own their own home. You have squeezed every ounce of value out of Hong Kong people, and you're still talking about a shortage of housing supply. Why? Because you are sitting on available land. Tai Hang West is one example, and there are many more. Still, you tell us that you can't even meet the target set under the LTHS. How can you face Hong Kong people? I have made it very clear that when it comes to the LTHS target, we will take into account long-term housing demand, and we will set a target, a sustainable target. Last year, we have identified land to produce 237,000 units. This year, we have identified land to produce 248,000 public housing units. So the supply has increased. It's a fact that there is a shortage of land. It's not an excuse. That's why we have set up the task force on land supply to find and develop land for Hong Kong's future development. Thank you. Mr. Kwok Wai Keung. Members have made a valid point. You can't even meet the target with the split of 60-40, and you now adjust it to 70-30. After the change to 70-30, at Kai Tak and Anderson Road, you have used a number of sites for public housing. I know some work has been done, but still that is not enough because of the sheer volume of the shortage. Mr. Wong Kok-king from the FTU must be very disappointed because at the outset when LTHS was first floated, we were looking forward to a panacea or a solution to address our housing needs. We thought that this panacea will solve all our problems, but now 5 years down the line, we realize that it is not a panacea at all. It is the waste of time, in fact. We've been talking about LTHS for 5 years, and still you told us that there is not enough housing land. There is a shortage of about 70,000 units compared to your target. You do need to resolve land shortage and find more land for housing production. Now I would like to turn to something more short term. I am a member of the HA. The HA said that they have resources, but they don't have land. You have been saying that you have all these strategies, but you don't have land. Well, there are over 20 old housing estates. Why don't you simply come up with a schedule to redevelop them? You say there is not enough land. Why don't you use existing public housing estates to produce more housing units by redevelopment? You also talk about transitional housing. Why don't you simply stop the talking and start doing something? You only churn out several hundred in transitional housing a year. Don't waste our time. Do something solid. Do as much as you can. Don't lose any time. Don't just keep saying that you don't have enough land and our hands are tied. That's why people are unhappy when you come up with these excuses. Yes, there are objective difficulties and the public will understand. But what about things that you can do? Have you done your best in areas where you can do something? Secretary. In relation to housing supply for public housing, yearly supply has been increasing. This shows that the HA and the Housing Department have done a lot of work. Otherwise, we will not have a higher production. We do understand that because of housing shortage, there is a lot of work to be done. In the middle of last year, there is the task force on transitional housing set up under the Transport and Housing Bureau. In the past year, we have done a lot of work. We have worked with the Lands Department to find idle land. We have worked with NGOs and interested parties to identify ways to provide transitional housing, including modular social housing, modifying industrial buildings, or other ways. We mobilize the community to achieve higher flexibility and to increase the pace. When it comes to community housing movement, we see that within just 1 year, we have seen some fruitful results. We encounter a number of restraints. So we decided to start transitional housing in this way. We will continue to take stock of what more we can do to increase the production volume as well as to increase the pace. Mr. Ao-nok-kin, every time we discuss about LTHS, it gives me the impression that we are talking to a stone wall. We have been talking about the same point many times, but it seems that the administration is stonewalling us. I asked them just to be honest with us. What do I mean by that? Well, you have launched the GSH, the starter home pilot scheme. You're just trying to encourage people to buy their homes, including those living in PRH units. But now you want to add that to future target, and you've changed the categorization from PRH to PRH/GSH. I don't agree with that. These are two different target groups. They are two different strata. So you're going to produce more GSH flats. You say that you help people to buy their home, but for a lot of people, they don't want to buy their own home.
They only hope to rent a good place to call home. Well, you are saying that we are catching up with the PRH. Well, if you can't catch up, there are a lot of factors involved. You can explain to us. Is it really that you cannot catch up? You should see the Mingbo, an article by Yu Chong-yim. The problem arises because of the reduction of land supply, not a shortage of land supply. There are two reductions in 85, in 01 to 09. There are two historical periods with historical reasons that the administration control the land supply. The core of the problem is the administration sells land for income. So the land supply for PRH and for the GSH are in short supply. It is your creation. It is not a matter of large-scale reclamation. You should know that whether or not you had really control the land supply. So you have to know that the PRH should be separated from the GSH with different population group and with different needs. You should break the myth of using control of land supply as a matter of income for the administration. All parties have given different options for the increase of land supply. For the different options proposed for the Western District, etc. But I think the administration has to be honest about the control of land supply. I'd like to speak on the GSH, Permanent Secretary. There is no reduction of PRH units because this is an exchange for the GSH and PRH. And the sites will also be suitable. As for the third question, the administration will decide for GSH according to the existing situation. The PRH will not change. PRH is a safety net, and we also insist on keeping the waiting time to 3 years. There are lots of requests for members. I have to draw a line here. So I will increase our meeting time by 15 minutes. There are motions, at least 3, being proposed now. So if you have any, you should propose them now. Mrs. Chang Hoi-yan, I'm rather disappointed for the IHH and even for the middle class. They are now becoming more and more disappointed. For IHH, for all these SDU people, they have a very long waiting time. For the middle class, the private market is so expensive they cannot afford it. And I am further disappointed with the response from the administration. And for the all proposals made here, including bipartisan proposal, you are refusing rent control or rent subsidy. You have refused both. And is this proposed here, the redevelopment of aged estates? Well, you are saying that that cannot be done because that will only lead to prolonged waiting time. So all proposals are rejected. Now you are giving us long-term views, but I would like to focus on the short and short term. Can you have earmarked funds for transitional housing so that the SDU households can benefit from that? The URA have resumed a lot of dilapidated buildings which are left idle. Can they release some so that we can have some transitional housing? Can you give us a timetable and the funding of transitional housing? Well, we hope that you would reconsider the rent control and rent subsidy. And for the middle class, they have to have high rents. So how are you going to help them? And what about redevelopment of aged estates? For instance, the Taihang West estate. Apart from that estate, there are lots of other aged estates to be redeveloped to increase in density and to provide more land. As for the loan, I have already replied to the rent control, etc. As for the URA, they have resumed old buildings, and we would consult with them so that the existing old buildings could be transformed to shared use. As for the Taihang West estate, the social welfare institutions are now consulting the residents there. They have to have a consensus with the residents. And once their concerns are met, it will be redeveloped. As for transitional housing, it is being discussed within the administration, and we will seek for further resources. Mr. Junius Ho, as for transitional housing, I'm in support of it because we need to have the transitional housing to meet immediate needs. In 2010, in Shakok, we stopped the transitional housing. However, In Longbin, Boating, and Taibo, you still have some. So we know that the PRHA has a long waiting list. So we need to have transitional housing. Well, if you provide temporary housing, it's better to have permanent ones. However, that still can be considered. We are in shortage of 1,200 hectares, and the task force says that there are 6 options. One is the new developed areas in new territories in Dongchong, Guodong, Hongshui-kiu, etc. There will be 2,500 hectares that can be provided. And in 2013, you are looking at the prohibited areas, closed areas on the border. Well, I think that in Shenzhen and in the border areas or the closed areas between Shenzhen and Hong Kong, we can release about 20 square kilometers that can be made available, that we could build 100 buildings for the 120 SDU households as temporary measures. That could be done rather speedily, so that within 2 years we could supply them with temporary housing, so as to tie them over the waiting time. For the transitional housing, the task force is doing all they can to identify sites. If the sites could be reallocated for permanent housing, that will be done. However, in the absence of long-term allocation, that site could be used for transitional housing. In different areas, if they have enough transport and enough facilities, we would consider turning them into transitional housing sites. I have 4 minutes. Mr. Ho. For the supporting facilities, roads, etc., and also infrastructure, well, for temporary housing, it wouldn't be that complicated. You can build some roads, not the highest quality ones. Even if you go for quality, that could be permanent. I think that for the border area, we can turn these areas into spade ready. Well, because that area, it would be easier to turn them into transitional housing sites, as there are less difficulties with property rights. I am a member of the HA. I know that the HA and the administration, there are different solutions now being sought after. Well, it is a matter of identification of sites. Some would say brownfield sites, some would say it's the golf course, some would say it's reclamation. The golf course, they would have 8 areas that can be released from the golf course. How many units could be built, and how long would it take? If you have to redevelop the golf course, how many units can be built and the time period? We need to have construction preparations, as well as facilities and also formation of site, etc. Deputy Secretary, for that golf course, the task force on land supply. There are 32 hectares with 8 holes. A few years back, the Development Board has an initial study for the 32 hectares there. What would be the size of buildings that can be built, units that can be built, because it is in the area of 4,000 units. So it is only near the Shangshui and Shangshui that when you have better facilities that you could have higher density. The golf course is is a government land, so there is no resumption. But there are old trees there. We have to meet the environment requirements. However, the task force suggested that we will have a short, middle, and long-term scheme for that golf course. I am not a member of the golf course club. However, this is a matter of debate and controversy. The Finland golf course is an international golf club, and for many years it is an important part for the international standing of Hong Kong. Of course, we hope that the housing problem can be solved. However, it can only provide 4,000 units only, but that will be a loss of the international status as at such an expense. Well, for the fish balls, for are you going to add 2 more fish balls? No, I don't want them. Or so some sources, no, I don't want them.
Well, if you want to increase housing supply to help those who are in need, it doesn't mean that you have to do it at the expense of others. If you develop that section of the golf course, you can only churn out 4,000 units. Why don't you consider other alternatives? Please don't give in to populism. Your view is noted. Well, I asked the administration to do that. Next is Mr. Ray Chan. Thank you. On the 3rd of December, we had a meeting and I moved a motion asking for rent subsidy for those who are waiting for PRH units. It was supported. The administration said that rent subsidy cannot help, but we see that for the average waiting time for general applicants is 5.5 years. There will be more and more new arrivals waiting for PRH units. I'm afraid the waiting time will get longer. Well, we talk about a 3-prong approach: rent control, rent subsidy, and vacancy tax. This will reduce the burden from rental without affecting supply. But what we can see is that where there is even consensus in the Legislative Council to help those who are in dire need, the administration still will not consider them. We ask for rent subsidy to actually help those who are in need. And it's not just financial assistance. It does a lot to the mind of those who are waiting. They are now waiting for 5 years and they will have to wait longer. They will turn against the government. We read about news every so often saying that, well, new arrivals come to Hong Kong, they only have to wait for just a few years before they have a flat. Well, I don't think there is any correlation between the number of years new arrival for new arrivals after they have arrived in Hong Kong. I think the hostile sentiment in the general public is between landlords and tenants. buy a flat, you enjoy tax rebate, but if you rent, there is no tax rebate. If you're waiting for PRH unit, people are unhappy because new arrivals have been allocated a flat even though they have land on the mainland. So I'd like to ask about paragraph 40. It says that the administration will combat tenancy abuse, say for example those who have properties. Is it really the case that a lot of people are allocated PRH units even when they have properties? Do you have any figures? Can you actually find these cases? Can you successfully find information? Has there been any successful cases that you have identified when the PRH tenants actually own land and property on the mainland? Permanent Secretary, if people are concerned about how we deal with new arrivals, you will find the clear policy under the HA. Well, at least half of the members of the household will have to be living in Hong Kong for at least 7 years before the household is allocated a unit. New arrivals, regardless of where they come from, if half of the members of the household have been living in Hong Kong for at least 7 years, an allocation of PRH unit to them is reasonable. It's not an abuse. If there are individual households with less than half of the members of the household living in Hong Kong for 7 years, then they will not be allocated a flat. What about those who live property or land outside Hong Kong? Well, then it will be something to do with well-off tenants. Under the well-off tenant policy, we have set income and asset limits. If someone owns properties outside Hong Kong, you will have to report to the household for the means test. If the income or asset limit has been exceeded, then you're no longer eligible for PRH units. Well, there are more and more motions coming in, so I would like to earmark time to deal with the motions. Next member, Mr. Siu-kin. When there is fire, when there is smoke, there is fire. A number of members have made some suggestions. The secretary has been saying that it's not feasible, it doesn't work. Well, if you call me to ask to do a poll, I will give you a very low rating. Let me ask you some questions. Well, you talk about identifying land for housing. Community has been making suggestions. First, brownfield site, and then greenfield. That means that you will first consider brownfield sites that are not for agricultural use, and then you will consider greenbelt and reclamation. Will you accept that? On the 27th of June last year, Mr. Lam Cheuk-ting sent a letter to ask the Development Bureau about land resumption ordinance. Between 1997 and 2017, on average, 8 times there has been 8 times when when the ordinance was invoked. When Mrs. Carrie Lam was the secretary, the number of cases has dropped significantly. Since the reunification, there are only judicial cases against 8 of these cases. So I'd like to ask, will the administration consider making use of the land resumption ordinance to replace public-private partnership to resume brownfield site? Well, if you say that it will take a very long time if there are judicial cases, I can tell you that for the 8 cases of judicial cases, it ranged from 9 days to 1 year. And in all those cases, the government won. So I would like to ask you, will you make use of land resumption ordinance to replace public-private partnership to take back agricultural land owned by private developers? There is also a question asked by Mr. Ao-nok-hin. You said that in 2019 to 2020 to 2028, 29, in that 10-year period, there will be 315,000 public housing units. About 200,000 of them will be PRH units or GSH. Can you make it clear, during that 10-year period, for PRH and GSH, what is the ratio? Secretary. I'll ask Ms. Ho to answer questions about land resumption ordinance. I thank Mr. Siu for his question. When invoking land resumption ordinance, well, we have been doing it, and there will be another occasion when we use it. We will consult members in the development panel about land resumption as well as project cost of Fanling North, Kutong North. I remember there are about 60 hectares of private land, including brownfield site in the first phase. If we meet the requirements under the law, that is, it is for public purpose, of course we will invoke the land resumption ordinance. Mr. Siu mentioned about public-private partnership. Well, very often under such scheme, the land is owned by developers or they are in private hands. If the government wants to resume the land and at the same time sell the land, it may not meet the requirements of public use. We can resume land in Fanling North, Kutong North because it is to develop new development area. Wang Chao is a public housing project. So in short, we will invoke the land resumption ordinance as long as we meet statutory requirements for proper uses. Secretary. About PRH and GSH. Well, basically, someone who has bought a unit in the GSH will have to surrender their PRH unit, or they will have to vacate their place in the waiting list, on the waiting list. So GSH will not affect PRH. We have never wavered from our determination to provide safety net for those who are in need of PRH units. Mr. Eunice Yong. This is the long-term housing strategy, but I don't see anything strategic in the report. They are just very rigid figures. You talk about a net increase of households, those who are inadequately housed, and other figures. But I don't see any way to help those who are in need of help. You talk about the increase of households, those who are affected by redevelopment, and those who are living in inadequate housing. What is the strategy under the LTHS to help these different groups of people? I don't see anything. Under the LTHS, have you adopted the demand as your target? Have you considered helping different groups? People, some other members mention about interim housing for those who are living in inadequate housing. I only see 2 points in the paper: private housing, public housing. You think that those who are inadequately housed will be housed in the private sector? You talk about changing the split to 70-30. But how do you actually help those who are in need? I expected the administration to take care of different groups instead of just giving us a litany of figures, telling us that they are forever chasing the target and that there is inadequate land, because it doesn't help those who are having a hard time. So can you tell me, how does the LTHS help those who are living in a appalling living environment? Well, this secretary, this is the planning for over a 10-year period. We have conducted assessments for demand in the coming 10 years. Then we will deploy resources to farmland and to produce housing publicly and privately. We have made it clear that we will rezone land to provide 310,000 domestic units. We will also relax plot ratio to increase housing production. We will also deploy more spade-ready sites to increase supply of public housing.
We also mentioned that in the past, well, the policy change made known last year, the revision of the split, so that we can increase the land supply for public housing, to increase housing units. This is a strategic policy, and we are increasing our efforts in this orientation. Well, you have not gone to the crux of the matter. I'm saying that for those suffering appalling living conditions, well, for PRH, you might need 10 years. And if you have to form a mining site, it takes even longer. So what are the transitional housing that can be made available to them that are safe and affordable? Well, we have already made clear the transitional housing policy in the document. Mr. Kong Junyu, I'd like to ask the Secretary, you are saying 315,000 for public housing units. Is it a check that cannot be cashed? Secretary, 317,000 public housing units can be done. We are reallocating 210 sites for public use, and we also have measures for more land supply. If we have enough land supply, then we are confident that we can build enough public housing areas. Well, the problem is we are afraid, because we are afraid that you have a target that you cannot meet. So what are the criteria for revising 70-30? But the problem is we have IHH population with 110,000 households involved. You are saying that you are looking for ways and means. However, there are 110 people living this undesirable situation. Well, last year we had an experience, that is to say, the artists in the industrial buildings, there is funding for renovation. Well, there are also calls that the Secretary can take the lead or the responsibility to set up such a fund for transitional housing. So are you going to take the lead and take up the responsibility for that. Well, if it's not an earmarked fund, and if you are only going to the community care fund and only small amounts of fund, well, can you say that to the public that are listening to us now? What are you doing for the 110,000 living in IHH? Well, for the task force set up for the transitional housing, they are continuing their efforts, liaising with departments as well as community services and institutions, looking for sites, suitable sites. We now have a certain number of sites, and also we have over 10 projects now underway, and we are looking for more resources to expand the provision of transitional housing. In this process, we hope to have local support and departmental support, because in the consultations with the local people, there are different views on these transitional housing. I said in the beginning that we should not give the impression that we have write out checks that cannot be realized or fulfilled. Well, for the land supply at hand, how can you catch up the shortage? The 315,000 units envisaged. If you cannot reach such targets, how are you going to be accountable to the public? In the document, in page 7, we have laid out the land supply. In 22, paragraph 22A, we have about 200 sites that we are reviewing the allocation. And if it is successful for relocation, we can provide a lot of units. And for the new developed areas, the Gudong North and Hong Sui-kyu, etc., these will provide about 230 units. If you add these two figures together, there will be over 600,000 units. If we have local support and departmental support, we are confident that this can be realized. However, we will need electrical support and the public support. Mr. Chu Hai-dik. Thank you, Chair. 2 points and 1 question that I'd like to make. For the projection of the 10-year period, there is a reduction of 10,000 units. We have heard that the building of public rental housing, there's a shortage of 5,000 units each year. Well, this shortfall of 5,000 public housing units has not, the impact of such shortfalls with the targets set out before has not been made clear. Well, for those who cannot reach public housing, rental housing, and they would fall into the paragraph B, C category, the IHH. So you have 1,500 households that have fallen into the IHH category. Well, you said that there is a shortfall of 5,000 in the PRH. Why is it that we have only 1,500 IHH increase? So I am afraid that I cannot see a matching of the figures here. When we speak of transitional housing, I'd like to stress that it is not a way of a responsible administration to just provide a fund to let the community let the community get on with it. It could be the case for commercial enterprise. However, for undertakings that meet the needs of the public, you cannot really rely on the NGO. So in the new estimate or new budget, you should not push the problem or the issue for the NGOs to resolve. In the document itself, you say here that there are 210 sites, the usage under review, and it can provide over 300,000 units. And for the NDAs, you can provide over 200,000 units. 22A and B, how big a size of land would you need to fulfill 22A and B? Mr. Chu raised the question that there is a shortage of housing. What will be the impacts for the LTHS? If a shortage appears any year, then that will be reflected in the annual report of the coming year. So it is a rolling annual progress report. As for paragraph 22A and B, we can provide you with the service area that would be needed. Well, if you have a shortage of housing, it should be reflected on the IHH figure. Well, if the resident is living in an IHH, then that will be reflected in the IHH figure for the coming annual report. Well, we come to the motions that are being proposed. So I hope that any members in the building would come back to the panel to vote on the motions, to decide on the motions. Now, according to paragraph 16, you can see here that there is a reduction of 4,500, which means 45,000 units reduced. However, there's only an increase of 248,000 from 237,000. So I would like to have an explanation. Why is it so? The private land reduction has gone to where? For the 70 and 30 split, which would mean that there will be reductions on both. And why should you have such a revision of the split? Well, for short-term option, you have rejected, for instance, the rent subsidy, rent control, and you would ask the community to implement transitional housing. What is the role of the task force of the transitional housing? Does it have a timetable, or does it specific targets, so that the public can understand what this task force is doing and what's being done to solve the problems? As for the private housing, apart from the sale of land, we can also provide private housing through URA or through the mass transit. It can also redevelop private land. So for private land, we are saying we are giving you the planning of the administration. Apart from land provided by the government, there are also other resources for the private housing. Well, the task force on transitional housing, it will liaise with other departments, relaxing policies so that they can provide professional advice and also some guidelines or assistance in fundraising. For the transitional housing, if there is a specific project, we will communicate such information to you. We'd like to ask you, for the task force on transitional housing, it should have a specific target. You are mentioning just midterm or short-term or long-term policies, but people are living in very undesirable situations. But for instance, we would like to know how many transitional housing can be provided each year, and how can you increase the efficiency of this task force. So I think you should go back and have further studies, come back to our panel, or come back to subcommittee.
I have another question for the Secretary. Please give us the information afterwards. The 5 years after 2023, what are the figures for housing supply? There are a number of uncertainties or unknowns that would affect the supply. Well, I'm afraid there is no time for you to answer now. Please give me the information afterwards. That's all for question and answers, and I'll have to deal with a number of provisional motions. I now appeal to members. There is no quorum here. We're still one short. Please ask members to come back, otherwise I'll ring the bell. Please ring the bell. We're one short.
好嘛，我哋等傳召嘅同事翻嚟啦，要。咁我哋一陣間呢就要處理呢，包括係尹兆堅議員啦。
We have Mr. Wan Siu-kin, Kok Wei-kang, and Mr. Vincent Chang. This motion are amended by Junius Ho and Eddie Chu. We also have Mr. Gary Fan, Mr. Fernando Zheng, and Mr. Ray Chan. They have been tabled for members.
These
motions are directly related to the agenda item. I will deal with these motions if members don't object to that. But we do need to have a quorum to do that.
我哋再呼籲喺大樓嘅同事。
Members who are in the building, please come down.
好，我哋夠人啦，係咪？葉太都翻咗嚟啦。
We have Mrs. Yip. We have a quorum. We deal with the motions. The first is moved by Mr. Andrew WAN, seconded by Mr. Wu Ji-wai. Please read the motion out. In its entirety, I'm afraid that there may not be enough time. Well, I don't think there is a need for me to read it out because the members have already got a copy. Those who are in favor of Mr. Andrew WAN's motion, please raise their hands. I ask the Secretariat to count the vote. Nine for. Those who are against, please raise their hands. Those who abstain, please raise their hands. Mr. Andrew WAN's motion is passed. Next, we deal with Mr. Kok Wai Keung's motion. You ask members to read it themselves? Yes. Now we deal with Mr. Kok Wai Keung's motion. Those who are in favor, please raise their hands. 4. Those who are against, please raise their hands. 10 against. Those who abstain, please raise their hands. 2 abstain. Mr. Kok Wai Keung's motion is negatived. Next, we deal with Mr. Vincent Chang's motion, amended by Mr. Eddie Chu and Mr. Jonas Ho. Well, we will have to first deal with Mr. Eddie Chu and Mr. Jonas Ho's amendments. Their amendments do not conflict. So we will deal with Mr. Eddie Chu's amendment before we deal with Mr. Chu's amendment. Any objections? This is in accordance with the Chairman's handbook of the ROP. We will first deal with Mr. Jonas Ho's amendment. Do you want to read it out? As long as members understand it. We'll now deal with Mr. Ho's amendment to Mr. Chu's amendment to Mr. Chang's motion. Those who are in favor, please raise their hands. I ask the clerk to count the votes. 2. Those who are against Mr. Ho's amendment, please raise their hands. Mr. Wu Ji-wai, are you going to vote? We're now dealing with Mr. Ho's amendment. 9 against. Those who abstain, please raise their hands. 3. Two. Mr. Wu, did you abstain? Yes. That should be 3 then. They are Mr. Andrew WAN, Mr. Roy Kwong, and Mr. Wu Ji-wai. 3 abstentions. I declare Mr. Jonas Ho's amendment negatived. According to the ROP, I think Mr. Eddie Chu's amendment, Mr. Chu's amendment does not conflict with the original motion and Mr. Ho's amendment. Now we deal with Mr. Chu's amendment. Those who are in favor, please raise their hands. I ask the clerk to count the votes. 11 for. Those who are against Mr. Chu's amendment, please raise their hands. 2. Those who abstain, please raise their hands. 0. I declare Mr. Eddie Chu's amendment to Mr. Vincent Chang's motion passed. Since Mr. Eddie Chu's amendment has been endorsed, we will not deal with Mr. Vincent Chang's motion. Next is the 4th provisional motion moved by Mr. Gary Fan. Would you like to read it out? No. Please read Mr. Fan's motion tabled in front of you. Those who are in favor, please raise their hands. Those who are against, please raise their hands. 2. Those who abstain, please raise their hands. 1. I declare Mr. Gary Fan's motion passed. Next is a motion moved by Ms. Dr. Kwok-kee. Please refer to Ms. Dr. Kwok's motion tabled in front of you. Would you like to read it out? No. I now put it to a vote. Put it to the vote. Those who are in favor, please raise their hands. Those who are against, please raise their hands. Those who abstain, please raise their hands. I declare there are 2 abstentions. I declare Dr. Kwok-kee's motion passed. Well, 3 actually. Now we deal with Mr. Ray Chan's motion. Would you like to read it out, Mr. Chan? No. We now deal with Mr. Chan's motion. Those who are in favor, please raise their hands. Those who are against, please raise their hands. 0. Those who abstain, please raise their hands. 2. I declare Mr. Ray Chan's motion passed. We have dealt with all the motions. Next is any other business. We have not received any requests for any other business. Meeting adjourned. Thank you very much.